Welcome back. In my previous video, I showed that Moses placed God's creation of Adam and Eve in 5800 BC in southern Mesopotamia, which would put them at the origin date and location of the Ubaid people. This map shows some of the early Ubaid cities in Mesopotamia. The Ubaid also spread throughout the Middle East over the next 2,000 years. Unfortunately, they became wicked and violent, and God decided to wipe them out in a flood. This graph of Moses chronology versus archaeological dates has the creation date of Adam and Eve and the Ubaid at 5800 BC. This video will cover the period represented by the blue line, which extends from the creation of Adam and Eve in 5800 BC to just before the flood in 3600 BC. There have been several estimated dates of the origin of the Ubaid, but I think the most thorough and technologically sound estimate was by Katarina Streit as part of her MS thesis under Joseph Garfinkel at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She did a Bayesian statistical analysis of all Ubaid artifacts and determined that the Ubaid originated in Waili in 5800 BC, which is near Eridu. By comparing the Ubaid artifacts with those of other cultures, Streit stated that the Ubaid had no known origin from any previous group in the Middle East. Well, there have also been many proposed Noah's flood incidents in Mesopotamia, but in 2017, Al-Sheikhli did a borehole study throughout Mesopotamia and found the flood layer from the Greater Flood throughout the country from Baghdad to Basra. And the typical estimated date of the Greater Flood is 3500 BC, which aligns with Moses' date of the flood, and there have been no other regional floods that covered the entire region. So that is the date of Noah's flood, and it corresponds with Noah's date. In 1993, Dick Fisher wrote 2 papers in Perspectives on Science and the Christian Faith, in which he showed that the culture of late Neolithic southern Mesopotamia matches the descriptions of the descendants of Adam and Eve, including tents, crops, livestock, and metallurgy, and Cain's worry about other people in the region. For many conservative Christians, this video is unacceptable because it states that all people are not descended from Adam and Eve, and that human sin did not originate with Adam and Eve, which is called the doctrine of original sin. Carol Hill wrote Original Sin with Respect to Science, Origins, Historicity of Genesis, and Traditional Church Views in Perspectives on Science and the Christian Faith in 2021, in which she stated that the doctrine of original sin is impossible. First, DNA evidence shows that humans began spreading out from Africa about 60,000 years ago. And this map is based on the rate of mutation of DNA or RNA between different people groups, and thus can estimate the time at which they split and went in different directions. By the way, this is not evolution. This is random changes in non-coding regions of DNA or RNA, which are then expressed in the descendants of people. So if humans spread around the world 60,000 years ago and Adam and Eve lived in late Neolithic Mesopotamia, then Adam and Eve could not have been the ancestors of all people, and human sin could not have originated with Adam and Eve. Roy Clauser wrote a companion article to Dr. Hill's article in Perspectives on Science and the Christian Faith, and he observed that neither Moses in Genesis nor the Apostle Paul stated that Adam was the first human, nor that all problems in the world stem from the fall of Adam in the garden. He pointed out that St. Augustine developed the doctrine of original sin, and he showed that Augustine used a faulty Latin translation of Romans 5:12 in order to work out this doctrine. The correct translation, which is what we have and Augustine did not have, is that all die in Adam because all sin, which means that everyone is guilty of sin, and Adam just proved it in the Garden of Eden. At least that's my interpretation. So I am not a theologian, so I am not going to get into the weeds on this one, but I encourage you to read the article by Clauser. So I'll now focus on the specific corresponding features in Moses' description of Adam and Eve and the archaeology and geology of southern Mesopotamia in the late Neolithic period. As Dr. Carol Hill pointed out in another recent paper in Perspectives on Science and the Christian Faith, and as many people or theologians have believed for hundreds of years, the four rivers in Moses' description of the Garden of Eden were in Mesopotamia. In addition, it is a dry region with almost no rain, and there were no farmers there prior to the Ubaid, which corresponds with, I think, Genesis chapter 2, verse 6. The second part of the table lists many characteristics of the Ubaid that correspond with Adam and Eve, such as an unknown origin, an unknown language origin, a temple for animal sacrifice, and indications of long life spans, including extremely worn teeth and small cemeteries. So this is the region of focus for this presentation. Beginning in about 10,000 BC, the Natufians developed agriculture in the Levant, which is this area, and the Taurus Mountains. And then the homeland of Adam and Eve and the Ubaid was southern Mesopotamia, where they had not developed agriculture prior to 5800 BC. This is a very arid region, whereas there's enough rainfall here for rain-fed agriculture. So God placed the Garden of Eden just downstream from the confluence of four rivers in southern Mesopotamia, which is southern Iraq, just north of the Persian Gulf. For many years, scholars have stated that this entire region was submerged in the Persian Gulf at the time, and thus the Garden of Eden could not have existed here. However, the claim that the area was submerged in the sea at the time of Adam and Eve has not been supported by recent borehole and soil sampling studies. The location where I show the four rivers coming together in Al-Qurna is in Al-Qurna, where the inhabitants claim that their town is the location of the Garden of Eden. So I'll just read the scripture. Now a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became four rivers. The name of the first is Pishon, or Pishon. It flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. The bdellium and the onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It flows around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. It flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. In 5800 BC, I'll show that it is likely that the four rivers came together near Al-Qurna, which is here. Two of the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, currently join at Al-Qurna. At the time of Adam and Eve, the Wadi al-Batin was a major river flowing out of Saudi Arabia. But it stopped flowing in 4000 BC at the time of a major climate change in the Middle East, the 6KA event. The Wadi al-Batin flowed through what we know as Havilah, or the land of the Arabs. It flowed past the Ma'd al-Dahab gold mine and extended to the mountains of Yemen, where there was myrrh, as in Moses' description of the Pishon. The Karun and Karkay river systems originate in the mountains of Iran. Moses stated that the Gihon flowed through the land of Cush. The Kassites lived in the mountains of Iran and conquered Babylon in 1600 BC, which was the time that Moses wrote this description. Cass and Cush are similar names, and this is also from Carol Hill. There are two indications that these rivers joined and flowed toward Al-Qurna at the time of Adam and Eve. An ancient document by Pliny indicates that these rivers flowed into Charax-Spasinu, which was near Al-Qurna. In addition, the oldest paleo channels of these rivers flow toward Al-Qurna. After the rivers joined, they discharged to the Persian Gulf in the Shatt al-Arab River. This would be the river that flowed out of Eden and watered the Garden of Eden. And as I said before, prior to Adam and Eve in 5800 BC, there were no farmers in this region due to lack of rain. And Genesis 2:5 says, "Now no shrub of the field was yet in the earth, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground." Most theologians interpret the plant of the field and the shrub of the field in Genesis verse 5:2-5 as agricultural plants. Likewise, the word translated as field, sade, refers to agricultural land. Thus, This first states that there was no agriculture in the area prior to Adam and Eve, as I've already said 3 times. For the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth. This verse does not mean rain had never fallen, but that there was insufficient rainfall, as is the case in southern Mesopotamia, which is an extremely dry and arid climate. As with this farmer, people need to irrigate crops in southern Mesopotamia. I actually don't think that the area where God placed the Garden of Eden looked like this prior to the Garden of Eden, since it was a deltaic marsh area, and it sounds like there was a natural type of irrigation system based on tidal fluctuations of the river elevation. Moses described the watering system of the Garden of Eden as either streams that rose up from the ground or a mist that rose up from the ground. In general, the Hebrew translations tend to have mist, while the ancient Greek or other Middle Eastern language translations have streams or springs. The word translated as mist is ed, and there is a Babylonian word edu, referring to streams, so that is the reason for the different translations. Whichever the source of water, it appears that it covered from the surface from above. Streams rising up from the earth and watering the surface of the ground sounds to me, I'm an irrigation engineer, like surface irrigation, such as this system in the region of Al-Qurna, where they direct the water between these 2 border strips. These systems either rely on the natural river elevation above the basin, or they use a pump to add elevation to the water. Moses stated that the Garden of Eden was downstream from the confluence of the 4 rivers. This is the region downstream from Al-Qurna. Based on borehole studies, Al-Shakely showed in 2017 that the area to the west of the Shatt al-Arab was deltaic wetlands in 6000 BC. Hayvert et al. Collected soil samples to the east of the Shatt al-Arab River and stated that the region from the Persian Gulf to Al-Qurna was a tidal flat in 6000 BC. This is one of the flattest regions on Earth, which is why there could be a 100-mile-long tidal flat. Since the gradient of the river was low, the river depth would probably have increased in response to the tides. The magnitude of the fluctuations would have depended on the proximity to the Persian Gulf. In this picture, I show the Garden of Eden closer to Al-Qurna than to the Persian Gulf, but it might have been much closer to the Persian Gulf. As an irrigation engineer, I tried to imagine how God might have dispersed the rising water into the garden. I am reminded of some beaches where I spent a lot of time in Tamales Bay, California, in which lagoons are behind the beaches. There is a channel through which the water flows from the lagoon out to the sea, but the sand of the beach between the lagoon and the sea is higher than the lagoon or any high tide. But during some high tides, the seawater floods the lagoon. This drawing looks inward towards the garden and shows some possible elevations. The beach would be the berm level in this picture. I, as an irrigation engineer, would make a gate structure so that Adam could allow water during high tides to enter into the garden every week or 2 to water the trees. On the other hand, maybe God designed it so that Adam did not need to control the water. Maybe water during extremely high tides would just advance directly onto the land and water the garden. When the water level went back down after the tides went down, the water would drain off the land and would prevent waterlogging of soils. Okay, so back to Hebrew. I am not able to add any Hebrew analysis, but I just wanted to show that there are several variants of Adam, which we don't pick up on in English translations. First, God made mankind, Adam, into God's image. Verse 27 describes the creation of an individual man, Ha-Adam. Verse 2:6 is the second description of the formation of Adam, when God formed Ha-Adam out of dust from the ground, which is actually Ha-Adamah. And then Genesis 5:1 recapitulates the creation of Adam and Eve with either the personal name Adam or mankind as the meaning, which is another meaning of Adam. So at first glance, this passage appears to state that Adam was created from the same material that was cultivated, that was flooded, and out of which the trees grew, which is the soil. However, dust from the ground contrasts with just the ground in the other three highlighted sections. And this is the only instance of the phrase dust from the ground in the entire Bible, even though dust occurs 47 other times and ground occurs 113 other times. So dust and ground are never used together in order to refer to the dust of normal soil. However, dust and earth are used together to refer to normal soil. So in the plagues of Egypt in Exodus 8:16 and 17, Aaron struck the dust of the earth, not the ground, in Egypt in order to instigate the plague of lice. God stated that Adam is dust and will return to the ground as dust. This implies that the dust, which he and Eve were constructed of at the time of this statement, is the same type of dust to which they would return. And a consistent theme throughout the entire Bible is that humans are made of dust and will return to the ground as dust. And this picture shows the dust of which they are speaking. It is biological dust. On the other hand, clay, silt, and sand, the components of soil, do not form in graves. If we analyze this dust, we would not find any clay, silt, or sand particles. Instead, we would find DNA, a long-lasting molecule that is degraded by sunlight or water, but does not degrade in a dry, arid land grave, such as the graves of the Natufians, I'll talk about in a minute. The DNA in the bones might last for 1 million years, but the DNA, even in the dust, could survive for many decades. I am honestly thinking at this point of getting buried in a grave. I want God to have some DNA to work with just in case. God made Adam from dust in the ground, and Adam would return to become dust in the ground. And the most likely meaning, if we allow for the existence of previous humans, is that Adam was formed from human dust in the ground. So the creation event reads as follows. Then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living person. The Lord God planted a garden toward the east in Eden, and there he placed the man whom he had formed. Many commentators have noted that the sequence in Genesis 2, 7, and 8 implies that Adam was formed outside of the garden and then placed in the garden, which was in Mesopotamia. According to the Targum of Jonathan, Adam thought that he was created from dust in the vicinity of Mount Moriah, which is in Israel, and he went to live there because he wanted to live in the location from where he was formed. And if the dust of the ground came from the vicinity of Israel, then this would have been the DNA of the Natufians. The Natufians were among the world's first agriculturalists, if not the first, and they developed the world's first irrigation system in Jericho. Thus, I am a big fan of the Natufians. And if I was God, I would pick the Natufians as the ancestors of Adam and Eve. Because Lord knows we need more irrigation engineers, especially these days with all the drought. So Jericho was one of the first Natufian agricultural communities. This was during the pre-pottery Neolithic A period over 10,000 years ago. The mound of this tell is the ancient town location at Jericho called Sultan, named after the spring, which the Jews call Elijah's spring because Elijah purified the water in this spring. At the base of the Judean hills, this spring always had an abundant flow of water, which provided water for living and enabled the early farmers in Jericho to divert some of the water to irrigate their crops and water their animals. The Natufians had been farming off and on at Jericho for about 5,000 years prior to the appearance of the Ubaid in 5800 BC. Well, due to increased exposure to animal diseases in animal husbandry, one of the most significant genetic changes in human populations is the adaptation to agricultural diseases. The Natufians in this area had been practicing an agricultural lifestyle for 5,000 years. Thus, if God was going to choose a base human genome from which to construct a set of farmers, such as Adam and Eve and their descendants, then it would make sense to start with a genome that had adapted to agriculture, such as the Natufians. And I just want to deviate a little from the main script here and look at the mound at Jericho as a reference point for the concepts that Adam and Eve were the first humans in the world, and that original sin spread biologically from Adam and Eve to all humans on the planet, and that there was a negative change in the entire world of nature, which many people believe, including the advent of volcanoes, tsunamis, storms, and other negative natural events, that anything that can be imagined after Adam's sin, and the entire world was wiped out by Noah's flood, another event. So Jericho is outside the region of Mesopotamia, and thus is representative of the status of the world before, during, and after the Garden of Eden and Noah's flood. Archaeologists find evidence of human habitation in the mound at Jericho beginning in 10,000 BC. There are ancient walls that the people constructed and evidence of their homes. Thus, Adam and Eve were not the first humans, not even in the Middle East. The mound continued to grow over the millennia, and changes occurred, such as the invention of pottery. At the time of the Ubaid, there was late Neolithic pottery at Jericho. There was no change in the condition of the people at Jericho before or after 5800 BC, the time of the Garden of Eden. People in Jericho raised and ate livestock before the Garden of Eden and continued to raise and eat livestock after the Garden of Eden. There was no change in hydrology, animals, or plants at the time of Adam's sin in 5800 BC. When Noah's flood occurred in 3500 BC, there also was no change in occupation at Jericho. People went about their business unaffected by the distant flood in Mesopotamia. As with any mound of human habitation or archaeological record throughout the world, Jericho shows that the events of Mesopotamia were local and had no impact on the entire world system of nature. Neither did Noah's flood in 3500 BC cause massive destruction other than in Mesopotamia. On the other hand, the sin of the garden was significant because Adam represented all people, and all people were condemned as sinners due to Adam's sin. Okay, well, back to the story. I reproduced this figure by Agranat Tamir in Cell Journal, which was produced under the auspices of the Reich Laboratory at Harvard, the most famous laboratory in this field. And I lined up the chronological positions in the Agranat Tamir figure with archaeological dates corresponding with Moses' chronology. This study was based on sampling of Bronze Age bones in and around Israel at archaeological sites such as Ashkelon, Ein Gazal, Megiddo, Yahud, Hazor, the Bakah, Shadud, and Ebu Beth Makkah. Forgive my pronunciations. According to my timeline of the Israelite conquest of Canaan, some of the sites were still inhabited by Canaanites, but other sites were inhabited at the time by Israelites. The focus of this paper was the group in the middle, so this group, which was represented by the sampling of the people in Israel. In their mind, every site was inhabited by Canaanites. Their view is that the Israelites originated within the Canaanites, but I think this is incorrect. I think that the Israelites and Canaanites divided after the flood and went in different directions, and then both eventually ended up in Israel. Regardless of the paths of origin, what we can see from the figure is that the base genome for Jews and Canaanites is the southern Levant. This would have been the Natufians in the Israel or Jordan Valley area, such as Jericho. It may or may not be important that the figure placed the origin in the 6th millennium, which is the same time that Moses' chronology places the origin of Adam and Eve. With longer lifespans, the model for DNA change and mutation, the basis of this figure is probably different than normal. So I wouldn't put a lot of stock into the position of the origin of the Israelites and Canaanites in this figure. This figure also shows that there was an infusion of Zagros mountain DNA at the time of Noah's flood, and this corresponds with my view that the family of Noah went to Gordon Tepe Sedagabi in the Zagros mountains after the flood, and that there were marriages or other relationships between the sons of Noah and local women in the area. And I will discuss these relationships in more detail in my presentation, the next presentation on Noah's Ark. The primary message for this presentation is that the base genome for Jews and Canaanites is the southern Levant. So I already discussed the importance of immunity to animal diseases from agriculture for selecting the base genome for Adam and Eve. In addition, the wetlands of southern Mesopotamia would have had an assortment of diseases due to insects, water, and animals. And this is interesting because there is a wetlands area along the Jordan River called Damia, which means Adam. Of course, the concept that Adam was from this location or spent enough time here to have the location named after him is entirely speculative, but I will share some other evidence that Adam and Eve spent time in this part of the Jordan Valley. There are some other ways in which the Natufians might have fit the bill for the base genome for living in the hot, arid environment of southern Mesopotamia. They had moderate to dark skin pigmentation, and that protects from sun, but also absorbs heat to counteract sweating and cold desert nights. And they had a relatively slight frame, such as which helps dissipate heat, and shortness of stature, which I'm not sure if they're all short, but that's also beneficial in an arid climate. So they had adapted to this arid climate, and they would be a good base genome for God to pick. Well, any more evidence on Adam being in the Jordan Valley? According to the Targum of Jonathan, Adam went and dwelt in Mount Moriah to till the ground out of which he was created. And Mount Moriah was the mountain on which Abraham was instructed to sacrifice his son. According to 2 Chronicles 3:1, Mount Moriah was located in Jerusalem and was the location where Solomon built his temple. However, as I have previously shared in a different video, the originality of this passage is somewhat questionable. The Samaritans claim that Mount Moriah was at Mount Gerizim, which is at Nablus. Here's Nablus. So here's Damia, the wetlands area. Here's Nablus, and then I'm going to talk about Tel Saf in a minute. The Samaritans claim that Mount Moriah was at Mount Gerizim, which is at Nablus and is up the hills from Damia, in the hills from Damia. In this part of the world, ancient people and their animals migrated back and forth from the hot Jordan Valley in the winter up to the hills in the summer. So, based on my experience, it is not surprising that Targum of Jonathan is aligned with modern data. If Adam went back to Mount Moriah to spend time in the region he was from, then he would have spent time in the winters in the area of Adam, and possibly in a location now called Tel Saf. So I showed you Tel Saf up here, a little bit up the Jordan Valley, as he grazed his flocks. And Strite and Garfinkel, and this is the same Katerina Strite that found the origin of the Ubaid. Strite and Garfinkel found that an Ubaid group living at Tel Saf, or an Ubaid group lived at Tel Saf from 5200 to 4700 BC. And according to Moses' chronology, God created Adam in 5760 BC, or possibly 5833 BC, and he died in the vicinity of 4800 BC. And I'd just like to say that it's not like there were a lot of Ubaid people traveling or dispersing around the world at this time. This is sort of a one-off where Ubaid were in this specific location corresponding to a time when the Targum of Jonathan stated that the founder of the Ubaid people went back to live in the ground where he was from. Okay, so I made this diagram indicating that God began with a Natufian genome from the Jordan Valley and placed Adam to the east in southern Mesopotamia in 5700 BC. And the next phase of the genomic history of Jews and Canaanites also has a curious correspondence with Moses' story. So I have them moving up here, not directly, but 3500 BC, they end up here. And this is where the Zagros mountain DNA comes into the picture, which I showed you in the diagram. And who knows what went on up there. But in my next video, I'll talk about it in more detail. Okay, so the word he formed, Jitzer, refers to the highly trained and exacting work of a master potter as he forms the clay into a beautiful pot. So we're back in Genesis 2:6, I think. If God began with the DNA of a Natufian, then he would have needed to transform that DNA to make Adam and Eve live forever. The concept of a master potter forming a pot is in line with God making changes in the DNA to allow people to live forever. There are dozens of genes involved in the specification of the human life cycle, and God would have needed to modify this set of genes in order to prevent normal aging. I haven't really given Eve enough time or credit in this presentation, and the reason is generally Moses and the Targum of Jonathan, etc., referred to Adam, and of course Eve was also there. So let's spend a little time discussing Eve. God took one of Adam's ribs and fashioned Eve from it, and it would seem that God took the DNA from the rib, or possibly other body part, and then formed Eve from the DNA. And here we have a picture of Eve playing with a serpent. That was a bad idea. And it really isn't a joking matter. Apparently, this was Satan intent on ruining the lives of Adam and Eve, just as he seeks to ruin all of our lives. And the fact that Adam formed animals out of the ground, of which this is one, indicates to me that God made special animals for the Garden of Eden. Thus, any peculiarities of animals in the Garden of Eden should probably not be interpreted through the lens of zoology. So here's a little theology. I think that God provided an attractive fruit and prohibited it, and then allowed Satan to introduce a seemingly, but lying, logical justification for sin in order to test whether Adam and Eve had the moral righteousness to obey God in the midst of temptation, just as every other human on earth is tested in their ability to resist attractive sins that are tempting. Adam and Eve did not resist and failed, just as every other human on earth has failed at some times. Unfortunately, in this cosmic courtroom, Adam and Eve represented all of humanity in a test of righteousness, and thus condemned all humanity as unrighteous and guilty of sin, condemned them to a spiritual death and judgment on the day of judgment. There really hadn't been a test before this because God had not given any commands to humans before this. The Apostle Paul spoke of Adam's failure and its impact on the human race. Romans 5:12 does not state that Adam was the first human. Instead, it says sin and death entered the world through Adam, and death spread to all mankind, not because they were the children of Adam and Eve, but because all sinned like Adam and Eve. Adam was a type of him who was to come. Just as Adam sinned as a representative of humanity and condemned all people to death, Christ was also a representative of all humanity on the cross, and his death gave life to all people who accept his forgiveness through the cross. In 1 Corinthians 15:45-49, the apostle contrasts Adam with Christ. Adam was made from dust, while Christ was from heaven. Adam was a living person, while Christ was a life-giving spirit. Adam was the first man, while Christ in one case was the second man, and in another case was the last man, which clearly indicates that this is not a discussion of whether Adam was the first biological human, but is comparing the chronological position of Adam and Christ as representatives of humanity. After they sinned, Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden because the tree of life would have allowed them to live forever. And just along these lines, I worked on a research project where one of the scientists created a genetically engineered algae that could only live in a biofuel production raceway. He did this in order to ensure that the superalgae would not escape into the environment and possibly cause ecological consequences. He provided this insurance against disaster by inserting a gene that was triggered by caffeine, but would cause death if the algae did not have caffeine. And he put caffeine in the raceway. These are raceways where they make algae go around in circles with a paddle wheel. He put caffeine in the raceway and enabled the algae to live. Similarly, the tree of life could have had a chemical that triggered a gene or gene sequence that enabled God's genetically engineered Adam and Eve to live forever. Maybe the tree of life was a coffee tree and caffeine was the trigger. which would seem to be a good selection in my mind, since all of my energy comes from caffeine. Okay, so back to the garden. This is a view towards the east in southern Mesopotamia. Because of their sin, God exiled Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. The angel was stationed on the east side of the Garden of Eden, and this might imply that they exited the garden to the east and then walked south along the Shatt al-Arab River, rather than through the impassable swamps behind the garden. The homeland of the Ubaid was Eridu, which was on the western side of the swamps. Possibly they walked along the Dibdiba formation on the southern border of the swamps to reach Eridu. This diagram shows the cluster of early Ubaid towns at the western end of the swamps. The town of Wiley in orange is where the earliest Ubaid remains were found, dating to 5800 BC. And Eridu, the most famous location, is in purple, where a temple for animal sacrifice has been dated to 5570 BC. The thick purple river is the Euphrates, and the thick red river is the Shatt al-Arab. One difference from previous river maps is that just the Karkay River in brown flows into Al-Qurna, and the Karun River in light blue is shown in its present location, where it flows into the Shatt al-Arab at a location closer to the Persian Gulf. Also, I think I put the Garden of Eden on the wrong side of the Shatt al-Arab River in this picture. So, with Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden, we are now in the verifiable and historical period of Adam and Eve's Ubaid descendants in the Ubaid homeland of Eridu. There have been many archaeological studies of the Ubaid. Joan Oates did the pioneering work in Ubaid archaeology. In her study, she estimated the origin date of the Ubaid in the range of 6300 BC. However, archaeologists have refined their methods and selection of source materials in carbon dating. And the primary change is that they have realized that wood can be reused for several centuries in the desert, and thus is not a reliable indicator of age. Instead, materials such as seeds and grains are much more certain to have grown in the year they are deposited. So this is the basis of Katerina Streit's estimate of 5800 BC, plus or minus 100 years. So this is the same Streit, Katerina Streit, who published the work on Tel Sap. And she also determined that the Ubaid had no origin group. Their pottery was different, their housing construction was different, and so they didn't originate from any other group. Thus, she stated that the Ubaid did not have any origin group. Okay, well, if you're interested, there are many YouTube videos on the Ubaid. The first video is by me. CBS made the second video about the Garden of Eden in marshlands of southern Iraq called Resurrecting Eden. And the rest of the videos are by professional archaeologists. Moses stated that Adam and Eve and their descendants practiced animal sacrifice. Likewise, the Ubaid practiced animal sacrifice. The earliest Ubaid temple was at Eridu in 5570 BC, as I've already said, and it had the first altar for animal sacrifice in world history. And you can see a picture of this temple at the ASOR website. Over the centuries, the Ubaid built larger and larger temples in Eridu, and this is one of their later temples, which, as you can see, still had an altar for animal sacrifice and offering table as the focal points of the worship experience. This is very similar to the later Jewish temples in which the altar for animal sacrifice was the focal point of the temple. Unlike almost all cultures in ancient times, the Ubaid did not have idols nor worship idols. And this indicates that they were monotheists and worshiped one God, as one would expect, for the descendants of Adam and Eve, who began to call on the name of the Lord. The Ubaid had many attractive qualities, but let me preface this slide by stating that the Ubaid were a Neolithic culture and Neolithic cultures around the world tended to be much more egalitarian than the quote unquote civilized cultures that followed them. Thus, many of these characteristics might be applied to other Neolithic cultures. According to archaeologists, the early Ubaids seemed particularly unconcerned with material status or possessions. There were no walls around their cities, no weapons of war, probably no large houses for chieftains, and very little jewelry or other signs of wealth. Archaeologist Frank Hole, who's a famous archaeologist from Yale, stated that if elites did not control people during the Ubaid period, then ritual must have controlled them. The many temples indicate that there was a broadly shared religious ideology, with the leaders probably also doubling as priests. The Ubaid culture spread peacefully throughout the Near East into areas of what are now Iraq, Arabia, Iran, Syria, and Israel. Jason Moser, who runs the World History website, stated that the language of the Ubaid, Sumerian, was a language isolate, which means that it was not derived from any other language. This would make sense if the Ubaid were created by God from dust. It is interesting to consider whether God taught the Ubaid how to speak Sumerian, or whether he just implanted it into their brains. It seems that God implanted the language because it seems that they were able to speak immediately upon entering the garden. Sumerian was the primary language of the region for almost 3,000 years until the Tower of Babel in 3100 BC, when the language was mixed with and eventually replaced by Akkadian, which was a language that originated in Africa. As Moser stated, Sumerian eventually died out as a spoken language by the end of the third millennium. An archaeologist friend told me that the reason that we know that nobody lived for 1,000 years is that there is no evidence of worn teeth, which one would expect if people were really old. However, the archaeologist who examined skulls from the Eridu seminary stated that the Eridu teeth were remarkably worn. The word remarkably indicates that the level of wear on their teeth was not normal. Archaeologist Max Malawan, shown in this picture, proposed that the wear was due to gritty inclusions in their flour. However, remarkably worn teeth would also be expected for remarkably old people. If people lived for 1,000 years, then there would be a much lower fraction of dead people in cemeteries. At least I think so. The Ubaid cemetery in Eridu was very small in comparison to the normal size of cemeteries given the population of Eridu. In addition, there were no burials in Ubaid Phase 1 in southern Mesopotamia at the villages of El-Uwaili, Eridu, or Ubaid. It seems that no Ubaid person died for the first 400 to 500 years of Ubaid history. Cemeteries appear in southern Mesopotamia in Ubaid Phase 3, which began in 4800 BC, 1,000 years after the first evidence of the Ubaid in Uwaili. Even then, the Eridu Ubaid Phase 3 cemetery was 1/10 the size that would be expected for the number of people who inhabited Eridu. Of course, there's possible explanations that people have proposed, such as they floated the bodies down the river. But, you know, one possibility is the people lived a really long time. Well, nothing good lasts forever on this planet. Genesis 6:11. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God and full of violence, and God looked upon the earth and saw that it was corrupt, for all living creatures on the earth had corrupted their ways. So Moses stated that the region became violent and wicked, and thus God decided to destroy them. The word Eretz, translated here as earth, often refers to a region such as the Eretz of the Babylonians and the Eretz of Israel, so it could refer to the Eretz of Mesopotamia. The Middle URUK culture in southern Iraq began in 3800 BC, and obviously became obsessed with wealth based on their archaeological evidence. And they began to colonize outlying regions, and they killed people who did not comply. For example, archaeologists found 4 mass graves at Tel Brak in Syria in the period from 3800 to 3600 BC. So In the next video, we'll look at Noah's flood, but we'll stop here with the evil people, the wicked and violent people in 3800 to 3600 BC. One more indication of the origin of Adam and Eve in Mesopotamia is in the writings of the Sumerians. The Sumerians followed the Ubaid in Mesopotamia. One of the correlations between the Sumerians and the writings of Moses is that the Sumerian king list had 8 kings before the flood, which is reasonably close to the number of patriarchs prior to Noah's flood, 10. The Sumerian kings had many thousands of years-long lives, which, although not true, corresponds with the long lives of the patriarchs. As with the Ubaid, the Mesopotamian king list has Eridu as the first capital. There are also several stories from ancient Iraq to Egypt of a character fitting one or more characteristics of Adam. So let's review again the many indications that late Neolithic southern Mesopotamia and the Ubaid were the location of the Garden of Eden and the descendants of Adam and Eve, respectively. The 4 rivers correspond with the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, Karkay, and Wadi al-Batin rivers. There was no agriculture in the region prior to Adam and Eve due to insufficient rainfall. As with Moses' timeline, the Ubaid originated in 5800 BC. They had an unknown origin in language, or unknown origin of their language, as would be expected for a people created from dust. The first temple for animal sacrifice in world history was found in 5570 BC Eridu, which is just 200 years after Moses' date of creation of Adam and Eve. As expected for people with extremely long lives, the cemetery at Eridu was extremely small, and the skeletons had extremely worn teeth. The initial peaceful culture of the Ubaid was followed by the wicked and violent Middle URUK culture prior to the flood. Finally, I would like to say that the political spread of the Ubaid corresponds with the idea that they had been specially endowed by God with long lives, which would have enabled them to gain a foothold on life in general. Thank you for listening.